Here is an overview of the structure and message of the book of Jonah. Begin with some historical context. The dates here, remember in BC, as the years go on, we count down to 0. So the early date is 853 BC, and Israel is made a vassal state to Assyria. Now, vassal state just means they're still governed by a king, but it's a little king, and that little king is subservient to the big king, the king of Assyria. And so they're still self-governed, but they're made subservient to Assyria. About 80 years later, we have the ministry of Jonah as a prophet, and about 50 years after Jonah, you have Israel is exiled to Assyria. We have one other occurrence of Jonah in the Old Testament. It's in the book of 2 Kings. Jonah was a prophet during the reign of Jeroboam here. Jeroboam II was an evil king. He reigned for a long time, but was very evil. In verse 25, we have this king, Jeroboam II, restored the border of Israel from Lebo Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, the prophet who was from Gath Hepher. So not a whole lot of information, but we have the same designation, Jonah, the son of Amittai, called the prophet. And we know exactly when he was a prophet. He was a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel, and he was a prophet at least during the reign of Jeroboam, overlapping somewhat. That's the historical context. The canonical context is that Jonah occurs after Obadiah, which is a little surprising because Obadiah was a prophet to the southern kingdom, Judah, about almost 150 years after Jonah. Obadiah was a prophet, and his book is in response to Edom after Judah is exiled to Babylon. And what's happened is Edom is super happy, and they taunt Judah because Judah has incurred this kind of wrath. But the message of Obadiah is, hey, don't be so puffed up, don't be so proud and gloating, because you will be judged. And so you have these two prophets, Obadiah to the southern kingdom much later, Jonah to the northern kingdom much earlier, but Jonah is placed after Obadiah because the message of Jonah is so fitting after the message of Obadiah. Here is Dr. Jason DeRoshi, who he summarizes the flow of thought with these books. Obadiah, he says, the message is, know this, pride and hatred have no place in my coming kingdom. This is why your brother Edom will be destroyed. And Jonah, the message can be summarized as, yet be warned, for your own pride and hatred of others resembles that of Edom, and stands in direct contrast to the mercy Yahweh gives to whomever he wills. So in Obadiah, it's judgment against the nations because of their pride, and yet Israel, like Jonah, can be puffed up in pride, like, yeah, the nations be judged, and not want the nations to be saved. So let's look at the macrostructure of Jonah. I pointed this out in an email that you have two large portions of Jonah, and each have these 3 corresponding sections where you have Yahweh commands Jonah, Jonah encounters people, Gentiles, in the boat and in Nineveh, and then after that encounter, Jonah prays to Yahweh. He prays to Yahweh in the fish, and he prays in Nineveh. But in the second section, you have this part which doesn't have a correspondence, and it's marked as the contrast of the book. I wanted to show you the structure in the Hebrew text. So it starts out with the word of the Lord came to Jonah son of Amittai, and the narrative is carried forward by vayikdal verbs. That's the regular way to carry the narrative forward. So you have vayakom, vayered, vayimtza, vayiten, vayered, all vayikdal verbs. And then you have this marked sequence here where it's not a vayikdal. You have a vav plus the subject and then a katal verb. And that word order only occurs 4 times in the book of Jonah. And so here is the first time, and it marks a discontinuity. And for here, it's marking a new section. Vadonai hetil ruach gedolah el hayam. Now the new context is the sea. So that marks the second section, that word order, and then you go on. It's a long section, and you have Jonah prays to Yahweh in the fish, where you have the verb vayit palel. This verb only occurs 2 times in the book of Jonah. Jonah always prays to Yahweh. So that's the third section. And then you have the second part of the book, same thing, Vayhi Devar Adonai El Yonah, and then you have Shanit. And here, the next section, Jonah and the people in Nineveh, you have that same word order, Vav plus subject, and then katal verb, V'ninve haita ir gedolah. Now we have Jonah is going to be with these people in Nineveh. Nineveh is the context. And so this kind of way of seeing Hebrew marking the structure, the macro structure of the book, this I think is probably the biggest benefit of learning Hebrew, because it's nothing, you can't translate this to be able to let readers make these kind of judgments, to be able to see the macro structure, because English just works differently than Hebrew that way. And the third, you have the use of Vayit Palel. Jonah prays to Yahweh. Yahweh responds here, Vayomer Adonai. And this is where we get the fourth and the climax of the book. Yahweh teaches Jonah a lesson. He leaves Nineveh. He goes out east. And the absolute, the pinnacle climax of the book is marked by the Vayhi, the discourse marker. And that is the final 4 verses of the book, where Yahweh really drives it home between this correlation between the Kikayon, Jonah's anger over the Kikayon, and Jonah's anger over Nineveh. So now seeing how Hebrew kind of marks the macro structure of the book, let's go back to the message of the book. And we see with this macro structure, you have these corresponding Yahweh commands Jonah, and specifically this is commands Jonah to pronounce judgment for sin. We see this explicitly here in the first occurrence, and cry out against it, because their evil has arisen to my face. The second time that Yahweh commands Jonah, the structure is a little bit different. It's still cry out, but now it's to it, the message that I am speaking to you. So it's not necessarily so clear, but it's already been clear. Cry out against Nineveh. Has Yahweh changed his mind? I don't think so. Has Yahweh changed his mind from the first cry out against Nineveh to cry out to Nineveh, it's still going to be this same message of judgment for sin, because Jonah gets up and he walks to Nineveh according to the word of Yahweh. When Jonah cries out the message, the word of Yahweh, his message is Nineveh will be overturned, message of judgment. And then when Yahweh does relent, it says God relented concerning the evil which he had spoken to do to them. So, message is judgment for sin. Nineveh is evil and deserving of God's wrath. But when God tells Jonah to go to Nineveh, we see that he flees. We don't know at the beginning why he flees. But his fleeing, his fleeing is always described as going down. And he goes down and down, further and further away from God and his presence. So he goes down to Joppa, to flee to Tarshish away from Yahweh, and he went down to Joppa. Once he's in Joppa, he goes down further into the boat, and he went down into the boat, to go to Tarshish away from Yahweh. These first two occurrences both have vayered, paired with milifnei Adonai, away from Yahweh. So God's commanded Jonah to do something, but he hasn't followed God in obedience. He's run away from God in disobedience, now incurring the wrath of God. So now the wrath of God, which is against sin of the Ninevites, is now justly upon Jonah for his disobedience. But Jonah keeps going down further and further in his disobedience. He's in the boat. Now he goes down into the depths of the boat. Vayona Yarad, he goes down into the depths, the recesses of the boat. And then he gets thrown into the sea, and Jonah talks about how he goes down to the base of the mountains. To the base of the mountains, I went down. So we see that God's judgment is against sin, and now God's judgment is rightly upon Jonah as it is upon the Ninevites. In the first section, we see that, okay, so you can have these correspondences with the macro structure up and down in the chart, but also we see some correspondence side by side in the chart, that Jonah is like the sailors. And there's several things that we can see, is that both of them are in a situation of judgment. The sailors in chapter 1, the judgment is the great storm. And they say, why is this great storm to us? Why has a God sent judgment to us? And in Jonah, his judgment is the watery chaos, the waters of judgment that he's thrown into. And God is pleased. I won't go there just yet. And then there's the human plea, and it uses Vayikra El Adonai. The sailors cry out to Yahweh, and Jonah cries out to Yahweh. And for both of them, Yahweh answers. He makes the sea stand still. And Jonah says, you brought up my life. And they both have the same kind of responses. They sacrifice and they vow. And so we can see that there's God's chesed, his steadfast love, is displayed to the sailors. When they cry out, they say, don't let us perish. And God makes the sea stand still, and they respond in fear. Seems to be the kind of holy fear that is fitting of Yahweh. And they sacrifice and they make vows. We can see that God's steadfast love is displayed towards the sailors because Jonah says that as much in his words when he talks about the sailors as being the idol worshippers, Meshamrim Havle Shav. They will abandon their chesed. Jonah acknowledges that God has shown chesed towards them. He's negative in his portrayal of the sailors, that they're not going to remain faithful to Yahweh because they are at base, by nature, idol worshippers. But we can also see that there's steadfast love for Jonah, because Jonah is also under the just judgment of God, that God, his wrath was satisfied a bit by having Jonah thrown into the sea, that he quiets the storm then upon the sailors. He could have let Jonah just die in the sea, and that would have been his judgment for sin. But Jonah says, you brought up from the pit, the waters were my grave, and you brought up my pit, Yahweh, my God. He says that the sailors have experienced their chesed, they're going to abandon you, but I. And so it's implicit then that Jonah has experienced this chesed love of God. So they'll abandon you, but I, with my chesed, I will, with a voice of thanksgiving, sacrifice to you. And what I vow, I will repay. And Jonah, experiencing this chesed, is happy to declare that salvation belongs to Yahweh. We can also see, with the macrostructure of the book, that the Ninevites are like the sailors. There's several things that they have in common. Both of them, there's judgment upon them, and the judgment is described as ha-gra'ah. The sailors say, with respect to the judgment of the storm, that ha-gra'ah hazot lanu, this evil is upon us. When God relents, it's described as he relents concerning ha-gra'ah, the evil which he spoke to do to the Ninevites. When the evil, or the message of evil, is sent upon the sailors and the Ninevites, chapters 1, chapters 3, the human authority, the captain or the king, has a similar response, that they frame it as perhaps God will relent and we won't die. So here the captain says, ulai, perhaps God will take note of us, velo noved, and we will not die. The same kind of uncertainty, perhaps will be spared, is said on the lips of the king, mi yodea, which is the same thing as ulai, perhaps, who knows. God will turn and relent, and the same phrase, velo noved. And both times, Yahweh does relent. He causes the sea to stand still, and God relents concerning the evil, and he didn't do it. And then we have Jonah's two prayers. And we've seen in the first prayer that he attributes chesed, God's chesed, explicitly to the sailors, but implicitly Jonah experiences chesed. He experiences Yeshua, salvation. And Jonah is happy, Yonah sameach al Yeshuato. He's happy about his own salvation. You brought up my life from the pit. With a voice of thanksgiving, I'll sacrifice to you. Salvation belongs to Yahweh. But when God shows chesed towards the Ninevites now the second time, he's angry. He's not happy anymore. Look, Jonah, there's two occurrences of chesed in the book. And both of them, they're on the lips of Jonah in the prayer. And chesed is attributed to Gentiles, the Gentile sailors in the boat experience, and the Gentile Ninevites. Because Jonah explains in chapter 4 in his prayer, he says, please, Yahweh, was this not what I said when I was on my own land? So Jonah tells God Now, for us, the readers, we see why Jonah fled. God said, go to Nineveh, and Jonah told God no. He says, no, I'm going to flee because he says, isn't this what I said when I was in my own land? Therefore, I hurried to flee to Tarshish. Why? Because I know you're this kind of God. This kind of God who is compassionate, who's tender loving, who is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. But steadfast love to whom? Steadfast love to anyone. Here, the context, to Nineveh, and one who relents about the evil. And now, because God shows his steadfast love to Gentiles, here to the Ninevites, now Jonah says, therefore, Yahweh, take my life, my soul from me, because my life is better than my death. Remember here, in the earlier prayer, he talks about his life, my life. And he's so happy that you brought my life out of the pit because you showed salvation to me. But now he shows salvation to the Ninevites, and he says, take my life from me. Or he takes my soul from me, because my life is better than my death. So we could characterize the macrostructure, trace the flow of thought with the word ha-ra'ah. But you wouldn't see this in English, because necessarily so. I don't want to get too far off track because it would be translation theory. But this, I think necessarily so, you have to translate this word differently in English. And it's just one of those things. Translation is necessarily interpretation, and you can't capture everything into the translated language here, English. So you have all these occurrences of ha-ra'ah, and here's how it's translated, at least by the ESV. Evil, 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 disaster, displeased, disaster, and then discomfort. Now we see all the verse references, and the first occurrence is why Jonah is supposed to cry out against Nineveh, because their evil has risen to my face. So this is moral evil, moral wickedness. But the next occurrence is the sailors talk about the storm as ha-ra'ah. So we can see that ha-ra'ah, it's used in a multitude of ways. It's used as the moral evil itself, but it can also be used as the fitting judgment for moral evil, the storm sent upon the sailors. We can see both of these senses of the word ha-ra'ah in 3:10 about Nineveh, when God sees that they had turned from their evil way. That's the moral evil. And God relents concerning the evil. Now this is the just judgment for evil that he spoke to do to them. And so I said at the beginning, the message of Jonah is supposed to be judgment for sin. And so both of those, sin and judgment for sin, is described as ha-ra'ah, that it's fitting and it is right that God sends his judgment for sin. But the question of the book of Jonah is it also a good thing that God has mercy for sinners, specifically Gentile sinners? And Jonah doesn't think so. This is where in 4 verse 1 we have a little bit of a twist in how gra'ah is used, because God doesn't send judgment for sin, the sin of Nineveh. And now Jonah says that's evil, right? So in 4 verse 1, and it was evil to Jonah, a great evil, that God didn't punish sin. But is that an evil thing? Is that a bad thing? Jonah says, I'm mad at you. I disobeyed because you're this God, this compassionate God, and a God who relents concerning the evil, concerning the judgment, the just judgment for sin. It makes me mad. I think that's wrong. And so God has to teach Jonah a lesson. And he sends an evil, a kind of judgment upon Jonah, and he rescues Jonah from that. So God, Jonah is outside Nineveh in 4 verse 6, and he's under the sun. And God brings up this kikayon, the plant, goes up over Jonah to rescue him from his evil. And so Jonah is going to get a taste of judgment, and God's going to have to teach him a lesson about that it is a good thing that he is a God, is a glorious thing that he is a God who relents concerning the evil. So now we can see the climax of the book. And once again, we're going to have a correspondence. Ooh, I actually highlighted the wrong one. We should have a correspondence between Jonah here and the Ninevites here. So both of them have this hara'ah. Ninevites, it's the message that Nineveh will be overturned. For Jonah, the hara'ah is the shemesh. For both of them, God relents or he rescues. He relents concerning that od arba'im yom v'ninvei nepachet, and God rescues Jonah by sending the kikayon. And so God rescues Jonah from the shemesh, similarly like he rescued Nineveh from being overturned. But now God is going to withdraw his chesed from Jonah to give him a taste. And so whereas Jonah was sitting east of Nineveh and he wants judgment to be poured down on Nineveh, happily sitting in his shade, God sends the judgment upon the plant. So God appoints a worm, it strikes the plant, and the plant withers. The plant withers just like he wanted the Ninevites to die. But now Jonah's mad, and here we get the climax of the book, where now that God has removed that protection from Jonah, when the sun shines, God appoints an east wind, the sun strikes Jonah's head, Jonah faints, and he asks his soul to die, saying, life is better than death. And now God responds in verse 9 with that same question, are you really that angry? First he asked of it, are you really that angry about Nineveh when I didn't send judgment? And now he says, are you really that angry concerning the plant that I have sent that judgment? Jonah is inconsistent here. And God's asking that question, are you really that angry? So God has to drive home in these last 2 verses a lesson on his steadfast love. Jonah had Jonah's angry about the plan. God says, you had pity. You pitied the plan. And not that pity was wrong or uncalled for, but showing that Jonah is inconsistent. Jonah had pity for a plant that he invested nothing into it. He didn't toil for it. He didn't grow it. And the plant, it didn't even last long. It was alive for one night, and the next night it died. So God says, you had pity for that. You didn't invest it. It was a plant. It didn't last long. Aren't I right, entitled to have pity for Nineveh, the great city, which is in it more than 120,000 people? People, not a plant. And lots of people. A big city. And these people are pitiable people. They don't know between their right and their left. Wouldn't you have pity for such people? and much cattle. Now that one trips up a lot of people, and this doesn't exhaust the meaning for it. But what I think is behind this in the question is that there's cattle, and that God shows more pity for the cattle of Nineveh than Jonah does for the people of Nineveh. At the very least, that's there. And so this is what we see, the message of Jonah, that salvation belongs to Yahweh. He is right and just to be able to save whomever he will, to show steadfast love to whomever he will. And here at the end, we get in question form to Jonah. Aren't I, Yahweh, right in having pity upon Gentiles? And it's stated in question form because this is a book written to Israel, who is very happy to see the nations like Edom judged. But will they be happy to see the nations brought to salvation? And it stay in question form because now the question how they will respond is placed upon the reader. It was first formed to Jonah, but now it's placed upon the reader of how will they respond to Yahweh's great steadfast love.